May 2nd, 1946, 1:30 p.m., 6 prisoners took over the most secure prison in America. For 72 hours, Alcatraz became a war zone. Bumpy Johnson was prisoner number 11117, and he was about to fight for his life. This isn't just another prison story. This is the story of the bloodiest uprising in Alcatraz history. 3 days of violence that would leave multiple guards dead, dozens wounded, and one man who survived by outsmarting both criminals and Marines. When the smoke cleared, the world would know that even in America's most secure prison, Bumpy Johnson was still the most dangerous man in the room. To understand how Bumpy survived the Battle of Alcatraz, you need to understand what Alcatraz was like in 1946. This wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress designed to break the most dangerous criminals in America. The Rock held 300 of the country's most violent offenders, men who had killed guards in other prisons, men who had escaped from maximum security facilities, men who were considered too dangerous for anywhere else. Bumpy Johnson had been there for 4 years, sent to Alcatraz in 1942 for conspiracy charges that carried a 15-year sentence. But even in the most secure prison in America, Bumpy had built relationships, gathered intelligence, and established himself as someone who understood how power worked. By May 1946, tension was building throughout the prison. The guards were getting more aggressive, the food was getting worse, and most importantly, several prisoners were planning something that would change everything. Bernard Paul Coy was the ringleader, a bank robber from Kentucky who'd been planning his escape for 2 years. Coy had discovered something that the prison administration thought was impossible, a weakness in Alcatraz's security system. The gun gallery on D Block could be accessed if someone could squeeze through bars that were supposedly too narrow for human passage. Coy was thin enough to make it through, and once he was in the gun gallery, he'd have access to rifles, pistols, and the keys to every cell block. But Coy knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies who were smart, dangerous, and desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at freedom. That's where Bumpy Johnson came in. May 1st, 1946, 10 p.m., the night before the uprising, Coy approached Bumpy in the prison yard during evening exercise. "Johnson," Coy said quietly, "you interested in seeing San Francisco again?" Bumpy studied the Kentucky bank robber carefully. He'd been watching Coy for months, noticing how the man spent hours staring at the guard towers, counting patrol schedules, memorizing shift changes. "Depends on the plan," Bumpy replied. "And the odds." "The plan is simple," Coy explained. "Tomorrow afternoon, when the guards are changing shifts, I get into the gun gallery. Once I have the weapons, we take hostages and force them to give us the keys to the outside." "And the odds?" Coy smiled grimly. "Better than staying here for the next 15 years. Bumpy knew it was suicide. Alcatraz had never been successfully escaped. The water around the island was freezing and filled with sharks. Even if they got off the Rock, they'd probably die before reaching the mainland. But Bumpy also knew something that Coy didn't realize. This uprising was going to happen whether he joined it or not, and when it did, every prisoner on the island would be caught in the crossfire. The smart move wasn't to prevent the escape, it was to position himself to survive it. "I'm in," Bumpy said. "But we do this my way when things go wrong, and they will go wrong." May 2nd, 1946, 1:30 p.m. The uprising began during the afternoon shift change, exactly as Coy had planned. Most of the guards were in the dining hall, eating lunch or preparing for the next shift. Only a skeleton crew was watching the cell blocks. Coy made his move on D Block, squeezing through the bars into the gun gallery like he'd practiced for months. Within minutes, he had control of rifles, pistols, and ammunition. More importantly, he had the keys to the cell blocks. The first person he released was Joe Kretzer, a machine gunner for organized crime who'd been serving time for armed robbery. Kretzer was smart, violent, and completely without mercy. He was also Coy's closest ally in the escape plan. Together, Coy and Kretzer released 4 more prisoners: Marvin Hubbard, Sam Shockley, Mirren Thompson, and Bumpy Johnson. At 1:45 p.m., 6 men armed with rifles and pistols took control of the main cell blocks of America's most secure prison. "All right, listen up," Kretzer shouted to the guards they'd surrounded. "You're going to do exactly what we say, when we say it, or you're going to die right here." Officer William Miller, a veteran guard who'd worked Alcatraz for 8 years, raised his hands. "What do you want?" "We want the keys to the outside," Coy announced. "The dock, the boat, everything we need to get off this rock." "I don't have those keys," Miller replied. "The outside keys are kept in the armory." That's when Bumpy realized the fatal flaw in Coy's plan. The bank robber had spent 2 years figuring out how to get into the cell blocks, but he'd never figured out how to get out of the prison. "Coy," Bumpy said quietly, "we got a problem." The next few hours descended into chaos. The 6 prisoners took 9 guards hostage, locking them in cells and demanding the keys to the outside doors. But those keys were in the armory, which was controlled from the administration building outside the main prison. Prison officials, led by Warden James Johnston, refused to negotiate. Instead, they called in reinforcements from the mainland. By 4 p.m., the Coast Guard, San Francisco Police, and FBI agents were surrounding Alcatraz. That's when Bumpy knew they were all going to die. "Kretzer," Bumpy said, approaching the machine gunner, who was getting more unstable by the hour. "This ain't working. We need to think about surrender." Kretzer turned the rifle on Bumpy. "Ain't no surrender, Johnson. We go out fighting, or we don't go out at all." At 6 p.m., the situation escalated beyond control. Unable to get the keys they needed, and surrounded by increasing numbers of law enforcement, Kretzer made a decision that would turn the uprising into a massacre. "If we can't escape," Kretzer announced to his fellow prisoners, "then we make sure none of these guards survive to testify against us." Kretzer opened fire on the 9 guards they'd taken hostage. Officer Miller was killed instantly. Officer Harold Stites was shot multiple times, but survived by playing dead. 7 other guards were wounded, some critically. The sound of gunfire brought immediate retaliation. Federal agents on the mainland opened fire on the prison with rifles and machine guns. The cell blocks became a war zone, with bullets flying through windows and ricocheting off concrete walls. That's when Bumpy Johnson proved why he'd survived as long as he had in the criminal world. Instead of fighting a battle he couldn't win, he focused on staying alive until the fighting stopped. While Coy and Kretzer ran through the cell blocks firing at anything that moved, Bumpy found a utility closet on the lower level of D block. It was a cramped space filled with cleaning supplies, but it had thick concrete walls that could stop rifle bullets. But Bumpy didn't just hide. He used the time to gather intelligence. From his hiding spot, he could hear radio communications between the federal agents. He learned their positions, their tactics, and most importantly, their frustrations with the stalemate. The agents were under pressure from Washington to end the uprising quickly, but they couldn't use maximum force without risking the hostages' lives. Bumpy realized that information would be his way out. At 8:30 p.m., as darkness fell over Alcatraz, the violence escalated even further. Federal agents brought in flamethrowers and grenades, determined to end the uprising before more guards were killed. The sound of explosions echoed through the cell blocks as agents tried to blast their way into the areas controlled by the prisoners. Smoke filled the corridors. The smell of gunpowder and burning metal made breathing difficult. Through it all, Bumpy stayed in his utility closet, listening to the battle raging overhead and waiting for his moment. May 3rd, 1946, 6 a.m. After 16 hours of continuous fighting, the situation was becoming desperate for both sides. Coy and Kretzer were running low on ammunition. Several of the other escaped prisoners had been wounded or killed. But the federal agents were also facing problems. They couldn't use their heaviest weapons without risking the lives of the guards still trapped inside. And they couldn't assault the cell blocks directly without massive casualties. That's when Bumpy made his move. At 6:30 a.m., he emerged from the utility closet and found Agent Robert Hensley, who was leading the federal response team. "Agent Hensley," Bumpy called out, keeping his hands visible, "I want to surrender." Hensley trained his rifle on Bumpy, but didn't fire. "Where are the others?" "Coy's dead," Bumpy replied. It was a lie, but a useful one. "Kretzer's wounded bad and holed up in cell block C. The others scattered when you brought in the grenades." What about the hostages? Miller's dead. You know that. Stites is alive but hurt. The others are locked in cell 403. Hensley studied Bumpy carefully. Why should I trust you? Because I can end this without any more guards dying, Bumpy said. I know where Kretzer is. I know what weapons they still have, and I know that if this keeps going, everybody in those cell blocks is going to die. Bumpy could see the exhaustion in Hensley's eyes. The federal agent had been fighting for 16 hours straight, and his superiors in Washington were demanding results. More importantly, Bumpy had information that could save lives. There's something else, Bumpy added. Kretzer's planning to execute the remaining hostages at sunrise. He thinks you're going to storm the place at dawn. If you want those guards to live, we need to move now. It was a calculated risk. Bumpy was betting that the federal agents wanted to end the uprising more than they wanted to punish him. He was betting that information was more valuable than revenge. He was right. At 7 a.m., Bumpy led federal agents through the cell blocks to where Joe Kretzer and Bernard Coy had made their final stand. Both men were dead, killed in the overnight fighting. The other escaped prisoners had either surrendered or been killed attempting to escape. The Battle of Alcatraz was over. The official casualty count was devastating. 2 guards and 3 prisoners were dead. 14 guards were wounded, some permanently disabled. The prison had suffered millions of dollars in damage from the fighting, but Bumpy Johnson had survived. More than that, he'd positioned himself as a cooperating witness rather than a ringleader. While other prisoners faced additional charges and extended sentences, Bumpy received credit for helping to end the violence. The federal agents wrote in their report that prisoner 1117 had provided crucial intelligence that prevented additional casualties and facilitated the successful conclusion of the uprising. It was language that would follow Bumpy for the rest of his time on Alcatraz, marking him as someone who could be trusted with information. The aftermath of the Battle of Alcatraz changed everything about how maximum security prisons operated in America. New security procedures were implemented, guard training was improved, and the vulnerability that Coy had exploited was permanently sealed. But for Bumpy Johnson, the uprising proved something more important than prison reform. It proved that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the most violent. It was about being smart enough to adapt when plans went wrong. Coy and Kretzer had been brilliant planners and fierce fighters, but they died because they couldn't accept that their plan had failed. Bumpy had survived because he understood something they didn't. Sometimes the best way to win a war is to choose which side you're on after the fighting starts. The Battle of Alcatraz became one of the most studied prison uprisings in American history. Hollywood made movies about it. Criminologists wrote books analyzing what went wrong. Politicians used it to justify tougher prison policies, but the real lesson of those 3 days in May 1946 was simpler than any of that. In a world where violence is often the only language people understand, the smartest person in the room isn't the one with the biggest gun. It's the one who knows when to put the gun down. Bumpy Johnson spent 11 years on Alcatraz. When he finally walked out in 1963, he was older, quieter, and more dangerous than ever. The teenager who'd taken over Harlem in one night had become a man who could survive 3 days of warfare in America's most secure prison. The federal agents who worked with him during the uprising would later say that Bumpy Johnson was the most intelligent criminal they'd ever encountered. Not because he was violent, but because he understood something most criminals never learned: the difference between winning a battle and surviving a war. If this story of survival, strategy, and the bloodiest uprising in Alcatraz history captivated you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is know when to stop fighting. And in the comments, let me know, would you have joined the uprising or found another way to survive? Next week, we're revealing the classified government files on this battle that authorities tried to keep secret for 50 years. You won't want to miss that.